When I say human trafficking, what do you think? What picture comes to mind? Somebody. I was going to bring you a mic, but I'm not going to do that. What comes to mind? Just shout it out. I'll repeat it. Stalking. Persons being human trafficked. What do they look like? Where are they from? Everywhere. Have you never thought about it? Well, most of us have a picture. First time I ever did one of these presentations, I said, when you think about human trafficking, what do you think about? Never forget it. There's one of the women from my church sitting back there, and she said to me, Mexico, the border. Because that's what was in the news when I started this, right? We were talking about the border, and we were talking about people being smuggled over the border. Now, here's a question. And on that piece of paper I gave you, those of you that are here, I had some questions in there. How many slaves do you have working for you? Shout it out. One, her husband. How many, the rest of you? How many of you want to say, I don't have any slaves working for me? Yeah, only one of you brave enough to say that, because you know where I'm going, right? Most of us don't imagine that we use slave labor, that we use people that are being trafficked. But I'm hoping by the end of the day, you're going to put your hand up. Now, there's an interesting website called Slavery Footprint. By the way, I'm going to email you out a document, a Word document that has tons of different websites. So don't try to write the websites down, because the document has links in it to everything I'm going to refer to, plus tons more. Okay. Almost all the books I'll mention, the speakers, organizations like Polaris, slaveryfootprint.org is a very interesting website. You can go out and you can put your lifestyle questions, answer a series of lifestyle questions. Do you drink coffee? Do you eat vegetables? Do you own an iPhone? Do you what kind of TV do you have? Now, I did this about a week ago, just in preparation for this, to make sure the site still worked. And it said that I use 67 slaves in the course of my daily life. 67 people in bondage to support my lifestyle. Why? Because they're in plain sight, and we don't see them as slaves. I want to tell you my story. I want to tell you how I got here today. As I mentioned, I'm an avid reader. I usually read complete books. I track them, and normally it's somewhere between 70 and 100 books a year. And last year I must have had, I don't know, must have got up earlier. I read 120 complete books. Finished 150 or 120 books, and then there's dozens of others that I read bits and pieces of, and I read, but a part of what I read is novels. That's my escape. I love to read a novel, and I get to do what I'm asking you to do. I like to put myself in the context of the story. What would I do if I was in that position? That's how, and when I teach people how to read and study the Bible, that's what I challenge them to do. I do a message on the prodigal son, and it's easy to look at the father or the prodigal. It's a lot harder to look at there's a lot harder to look at the older son. But sometimes we need to look at a story from a different perspective. And so I'm reading novels. That's a great escape for me. And I love a good murder mystery. because I like them. If you're gonna solve a murder mystery, you have to be able to get into the mind of the killer. Why would this person kill? Now, I don't want to become a killer, right? But that's how I solve the puzzle. So I got this book. It must have been I think it was on Kindle, and it was probably a freebie, and I got it, and I'm reading this novel, and the opening scene is a young teenage girl is found dead laying along the road. And as the story unwinds, they're trying to figure out, they don't even know who she is. Nobody's claimed her. She's not on anybody's radar for being missing. And as I'm reading this, I'm like, how does that happen? And could it happen? And by the time I get to the end of the book, it turns out that she had been trafficked. Along with some other girls, and it was in the end of the story. They found this house in a city is the pictured in the book, kind of like a Louisville, Clarion, Bonanza kind of town. And there in the middle of the town, there's a house with 6 girls in it that had been trafficked, and she had broke the rules, and they disposed of her. As I read that story, I thought, that could be happening a lot closer than I ever thought. Because the truth is, until then, when I heard about human trafficking, that was something that happened somewhere else. Now, a part of my story is that when I want to know I love to learn. One of the reasons I read so much, and if I find a topic, I dig in, and you'll come to understand, I think, throughout the day why I do that. But as I thought about this, could this really be how I need to learn a little bit about human trafficking? I see it on the news. I suppose I was like that lady. I thought of human trafficking as something that happens on our borders. It happens in other countries. Not too long before that, there'd been some stories on the news about people that were enslaved in China and some other places around the world. And it happens there, not here. And then I thought, well, maybe it does. So I did what I always do. I jumped on Amazon and I went out and I looked and said, well, how will I learn about human trafficking? And so I began to purchase books. I purchased 3 books right away. They came and I began to read them. And the first one that made sense to me was called Human Trafficking 101, right? I'll also send you a list of books so you don't have to write book titles down. Human Trafficking 101. And it was an introduction to human trafficking. And I began to think and want to go deeper. And so I looked, the next book was one of the ones I bought called In Our Backyard. What's going on in the United States? What's going on here in this place that I live? What's happening? And so I read Human Trafficking 101, and then I read In Our Backyard. And finally, I read a book called Renting Lacey. The subtitle is A Story of America's Prostituted Children. Renting Lacey. Renting a 13 or 14-year-old girl. That's what we're talking about. And I thought, wow, this could happen way closer than I thought. It might be happening in Erie, right? Now, I was living out in the country in Hayfield Township in Crawford County. If you don't know where that is, if you're on 79 and you're traveling towards Erie, there's the Sagertown exit. And if you get off of there, you're going north, you get off there and you go to the right, it'll take you into Sagertown. I lived to the left, just off of 79, Sagertown exit, right there on 198. And I lived in Hayfield Township. I lived in a lily white community that was rural and didn't have any violence, and and I thought, it's not happening here. So I thought, I need to see whether anybody knows anything about this. And I'm pretty well connected through Facebook. So I tell everybody I did a scientific study. I put a question on Facebook. You always get good data that way, right? So I put a question on Facebook. Is anybody connected to work with human trafficking in Northwest Pennsylvania? And the shocking thing was, within 20 minutes, I had at least a dozen responses that were either answer to the question, here's a person you ought to talk to, or private messages, including one from the fire department that I was a part of, who said, you do know that's what I do in Crawford County, right? Crawford County? There's no trafficking in Crawford County. I said, well, we have to talk. So the next morning, get her on the phone, and I'll never forget the first thing she said to me. You will not believe how prevalent this is right here. And my thought was, if it's happening right here, why don't I know about it? Why isn't it in the news? Or is it? And I'm not paying attention. And so I began an in-depth study. And as part of that, out of that conversation, she recommended that I contact Rose from Crawford County. It happened to be that I had met Rose at another organization. We were in a self-improvement kind of group together for a little while, and I had met Rose there. So I picked up the phone, I called Rose and said, Hey, I was talking to Jill. She told me about this. Oh yeah, let me tell you. She said, but I'm going to tell you, the person you ought to talk to is Debbie up in Erie County. So she refers me to Debbie in Erie County, and she gives me her email. I send her an email, and she immediately responds and says, it would be great to share with you, but you also need to know Betsy. And I've copied her on this email. And that began a series of emails. And from that, I was invited to participate in both the Erie County and Crawford County Task Force on Human Trafficking. And attend. The meetings, the Erie County meetings are still all on Zoom. A couple of the Crawford County ones have been live meetings, but I began to meet people and I began to hear stories. And I kept reading and I kept looking. And that's what brought me here. End up here, because out of that, I went to Rose and Betsy one day and said, I think we had to put something together. It was in the Erie Meadville district at the time. And so I called the superintendent and said, hey, would you be interested in me hosting a Zoom meeting, a webinar kind of thing on human trafficking? He said, yeah, just a cabinet. We've been talking about 2 incidences of human trafficking. There was one out near, I think it was Du Bois, that there was a group there that was Spanish speaking, and the churches decided they were going to do a ministry to Spanish speaking folks, and nobody came. But when they did some investigating, almost all those Spanish people had been trafficked there to work in restaurants in Du Bois. And he said, there was just a luring incident in Edinburgh last week, just up the road from my house. And so I called Rose and Betsy and said, would you do a webinar for me? And so last spring they did a webinar for me. And I started using that as part of a presentation. And while we were doing the webinar, Had about 90 people mostly from Erie and Crawford County on this Zoom meeting. And I started getting private messages as I'm managing this presentation from people that I knew. One was from one of my churches said, "Can we do this for UMW? Could we do a presentation for them?" And then somebody else said, "How about District United Methodist Women? This is a story that needs to be told." And then out of that, I was invited to another group in Meadville. And so I started doing that. So when Tom came to me and said, "What kind of ideas do you have for continuing ed?" I said, "How about human trafficking?" And as we talked about it, he said, "I think that's a good idea." I said, "I need several months to put it together because it's a deep and difficult topic." And so I think we started in August, and here we are in January. And I hope that you leave here today with a better understanding that I've come to, even though I've touched, you know what I've done? I've touched just the tip of the iceberg. I've been studying this book for more than 50 years now, diligently. And you know what I tell people about 50 years of study of this book? You know how much I know? Tip of the iceberg. Because the deeper I go, the deeper it wants to take me. And that's kind of what's happened here. So let's talk about what is human trafficking. I'm going to give you the official definition of human trafficking. Human trafficking is an act of recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining, or selling of a person by means of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of sexual or labor exploitation, involuntary servitude, forced military service, or debt bondage. That's the official definition. Now, there are three words that I want you to keep in mind. For it to be trafficking in the United States, there must be an act. There must be the means of that being trafficking, and there must be a purpose. So if we go back to our definition, human trafficking is an act of, and you got to go down through the list: recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, and obtaining or selling of people. And it has to be done either by force, fraud, or coercion. And its purpose, and there's a list of things that's the official definition of trafficking. And I want you to keep that in the back of your mind. And if there's nothing else, I want you to keep three words in mind: force, fraud, and coercion. If I was going to put anything up for you to hold on to, it would be my little sign here with those three words on it. And I want you to keep those words in mind as we talk today. What role does force play? What role does fraud play? And what role does coercion play? Well, let's just, I'm not going to sit and read you from the slides. There's all kinds of human trafficking. Now, this particular slide I brought down from one of the organizations says that the majority of human trafficking in the world takes the form of labor, and that is very true. But that's because it also includes a lot of sex trafficking, and we're gonna look at that definition a little further. So there's all kinds of ways. When we think about human trafficking, we tend to want to funnel it into a narrow field. Well, those are people that are made to work in a field and pick coffee beans. Well, no, not necessarily. Oh, those are people that are working in Europe in a brothel. No, it's not just. It is people that by force, which is a physical assault, restraint, confinement, or forced addiction. We're gonna talk about drugs a lot today. There's a lot of parallels to my study into drug addictions and rehabs, which if you're awake today, you know every one of our communities has major issues with. It ties in to this problem as well. One of the ways to control people that are forced into human trafficking is to use drugs and addict them so that they crave and demand what you want to give. Fraud, using false or deceptive offers of employment, marriage, better life. Hold on to that word, better life. What would you do for a better life? What would you do to sell yourself? Where would you have to be to sell yourself for a better life? Coercion, it's abuse of power. Debt bondage. We'll talk a lot about that. Taking somebody somewhere and then saying, oh, you owe me. And then create a situation where they can never pay you back. Especially with international immigrants, withholding documents, pulling the documents from them so that they can, and then creating fear. Oh, we're going to call the police, and they'll come and they'll arrest you and they'll deport you. And we'll talk a bit today about why that's so scary for some people. Let me just say that there's a difference between trafficking and smuggling. What makes the news a lot, if you've been watching any of the news networks, all the news networks have been talking about for the last, I don't know, my lifetime, it feels like, the struggle with the border with Mexico. And there's always a demand for more money. And part of the problem is somebody always has a simple answer. Well, this will work. Well, my experience is, and we're going to talk about problem solving a little bit, many problems are not as easy to solve as well. But we see pictures of people coming across the border, most of them on their own. We hear the stories about them being brought over by a coyote, by being brought into the United States. Somebody smuggles them in. And where they really make the news, though, sadly, is when a truck or a trailer is discovered with 40 people in it that are dead because they died of heat exhaustion waiting to cross the border. Those make the news. That's smuggling. Now, here's the difference between smuggling and trafficking. Trafficking is not always smuggling. They're not equal. We tend to want to use them interchangeably, but they are not equal. Smuggling, when you get to where you're going, if you're smuggled into a country, you're then free. If you're brought into the country, the people that bring you in, or they bring you into the country, then they set you free and you're free to do what you want to do. When you're trafficked, you're enslaved. So what happens is people are brought into this country from other countries, and then they're enslaved. And we're going to talk about how that happens. But they take their documents, they do all those kinds of things. But trafficking, you do not have to cross the border to be trafficked. what we tend to think about is that people that are trafficked are people that came from another country. When the reality is that somewhere, the lowest number I've seen is 75% of people that are trafficked in the United States are American citizens. I've seen that number suggested that it's as high as 90% of people that are trafficked in the United States are U.S. citizens. This is a problem of ours. So what do we do? Where do we go? There are some people that will say that trafficking and smuggling are completely different. I put this little broken line down because I'm not so sure. Sometimes what happens is we smuggle somebody across the border and then they end up enslaved anyway. And we'll talk about how that happens. Well, you're free when you get here, but you get smuggled across the border and you're vulnerable. You have nothing and know nothing. And I've read some incredible stories of people that landed on this shore, knowing nobody, knowing nothing, and could have easily been picked up and enslaved. Types of trafficking. There are two large group primary types of trafficking. Labor trafficking, which is the use of force, fraud, or coercion, that will be to recruit, harbor, all those words, put people in involuntary servitude. Okay, so you're made to work without proper payment. Now note what I said, without proper payment. One of the things we'll take a look at is what's known as domestic servants. I was reading a story just not too long ago about a woman that was brought in from another country and told that she was going to be a nanny for a wealthy family. And so she moved into their home and she's watching their kids. And part of her responsibility was to take the kids down to the park. Well, she started talking to other mothers and nannies there and found out that what she was being paid was about 10% of what she should be paid. And she was on duty 24/7, 7 days a week. And the people that she worked for had taken her documents for safekeeping. But they also warned her, don't get caught on the street, because you'll be arrested. It's estimated that somewhere between, I'm jumping ahead of myself. Sex trafficking. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about sex trafficking today. It is the commercial act, same definition of force, fraud, or coercion. To get people to do a financial or a sex act for gain. Or, and this is really important, and it's important because it doesn't play out like it should in my mind. A person that is a minor that is used for sex is considered trafficked. If they're used for sex for a commercial purpose, they're trafficked. Period. All right. And we're going to talk about why that doesn't always happen that way.